Kerry M. Kartcher has over 20 years of experience in the field of national security affairs, with an emphasis on nuclear weapons policy and arms control. Drawing on a 2-year project sponsored by the Advanced Systems and Concepts Office, this lecture will look at how strategic culture can determine a nation's interest in acquiring, proliferating, or using weapons of mass destruction, or how it may predispose a nation to comply with international norms and treaties constraining weapons of mass destruction. Following the completion of his current assignment, Kartcher will resume his prior duties at the U.S. Department of State, where he was Senior Advisor for Missile Defense Policy in the Bureau of Arms Control. He has served previously as a Senior Representative of the U.S. Department of State to the U.S. component of the Standing Consultative Commission for the ABM Treaty in Geneva, and the Office of Strategic and Theater Missile Defense in the Bureau of Arms Control, and as a Senior Advisor to Bureau and Department leadership regarding deterrence and strategic arms control issues. In May 2003, he was co-chair of a conference for Latter-day Saint national security professionals held in Washington, D.C. From 1986 to 1990, Kartcher worked as an assistant professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, where he taught courses on nuclear strategy and targeting, arms control, international relations, U.S.-Soviet relations, and NATO security. Kartcher is the recipient of the first annual Secretary of State's Award for Public Outreach in 2004, a Meritorious Honor Award in 1999, and a Hubert H. Humphrey Arms Control Fellowship in 1989. He is the author or co-author of several books, as well as a contributor to other journals and edited collections. Kartcher received a bachelor's degree in international relations from BYU. See, there's hope for all of you. And master's and doctoral degrees both in international relations with emphases in foreign policy analysis and strategic studies from the University of Southern California. Let's welcome Dr. Kartcher.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Professor Hudson. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak at a meeting opened by prayer. I have on more than one occasions suggested that we open our negotiating sessions with the Russians with a prayer, but it had to be a silent prayer. So I want to talk to you today about a project that I am overseeing at the Advanced Systems and Concepts Office of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency on comparing strategic cultures and on using strategic culture as an analytical device or framework for better understanding deterrence and proliferation issues related to weapons of mass destruction. So I'm going to talk about how we've approached this concept of culture and strategic culture. I'll talk about how we've structured this project within ASCO, which stands for the Advanced Systems and Concepts Office. It's a small think tank within the Defense Department, and I'm on loan from the Department of State to this think tank. I'll talk about some of the methodology issues that we've encountered in using strategic culture as a framework. I'm going to talk about the case studies we've chosen to look at. And then I'll talk a little bit about what the policy implications are and the difficulties in translating an academic or a theoretical approach to policy relevance, because that involves some very interesting dilemmas and challenges that you need to be aware of as you enter the world of foreign policy analysis and international relations. Let me start with one personal insight into culture and how it can complicate understanding. I was speaking at the American Cultural Affairs Center in Beijing, China, to a large group of Chinese that was mostly young Chinese. But among the audience was a very elderly gentleman, and during the question and answer period, this gentleman got up and began a very rambling commentary. And as he spoke, one of the cultural affairs officers from the embassy there was translating for me what he was saying. And he was talking about his experiences in World War II, and it didn't have very much to do with the theme of our presentation, but he was very earnest about talking about his sacrifices for the motherland and all this kind of stuff. Well, at periodic junctures in this man's very earnest presentation, the entire rest of the audience would break out laughing hysterically. Is anybody in here familiar with Chinese culture? How would you have reacted to that? Here's this gentleman talking about his personal and family sacrifices in the midst of war and devastation. He's not making any jokes, believe me. And the response of the rest of the audience is hysterical laughter. I wanted to get up and tell everybody to stop laughing at this man, that he was making some serious comments, and they should respect their elders. Is that what you would have felt like doing? Well, I resisted and heard him out, and then I got up and I said something about appreciated those remarks, and it was important to keep in mind the personal sacrifices of previous generations and some other fluffy stuff that the State Department trained me to speak and say. And afterwards, I asked my host, I said, what is with those people? Why were they laughing at this man? And she said, that is the Chinese way of showing embarrassment. She said that the younger people in the audience were extremely embarrassed by this person's comments because they were coming across as a criticism of the host and the guest speaker. And to show their embarrassment, they would laugh to dismiss it as something not serious. Now, did any of you initially react to understanding that reaction that way? What I would never have thought that the laughter was meant to reflect an embarrassment. So I had completely misunderstood what was going on, you know. And had I made something of it, like had I called Washington and told them to immediately begin bombing Beijing because of the rudeness of that may have had serious political implications. In this case, World War III was averted, and I came away a little better educated about culture and the differences in culture. And I have some other stories to tell about Russians. Let me just share one humorous Russian culture story. Okay, two. I had the occasion, this wasn't a regular occurrence, but on this one occasion, as I was in Geneva heading up a delegation, and I had the opportunity to stay in the ambassador's, not the main ambassador's residence, believe me, which is the top 2 floors of one of the main buildings in downtown Geneva with servants' quarters and everything. That's the main residence of the U.S. ambassador to the UN missions in Geneva. It's this incredibly opulent facility. No, that's not where I was staying. I was staying in a very nice apartment maintained by the U.S. State Department with State Department China and everything. And this apartment is designed for representational activities. And I thought, well, since I'm staying in this apartment, why don't I invite my Russian counterparts over and show it off to them? So we did that, and the U.S. Embassy there, the mission, catered a beautiful luncheon of multiple courses, and during the course of that, me and my American colleagues and the Russians conducted a lot of business. We had a great meeting. They were suitably awed by the surroundings and oh yes, I stay here all the time, and this is my summer apartment. You should see my, those kinds of things. And at the end of this, we got up. We got up and we shook hands and said, "Great meeting. Let's do this again." And goodbye. And just as we had said that, the caterers from the U.S. mission came running out and said, "Wait a minute, we haven't served dessert yet." This was the cause of some consternation among the Russians. In fact, they had to huddle and just talk about what to do about this dilemma. I thought this was a fairly straightforward foreign policy decision, We'll sit down and have this spectacular dessert. Well, it turns out that there's Russian culture is that it is bad luck to return to the dining table once you have gotten up and said goodbye. Now, how many of you knew that? Why didn't you tell me that? That's a poor excuse in a day of electronic communications. You should have given me some talking points about that. But then they brought out the dessert, and the presentation of the dessert trumped culture. Okay, one other little story. I was chairing a meeting with the Russians, and I wanted to be a casual, more very work-oriented meeting, and so I said, all right, let's take off our coats and roll up our sleeves and get down to business. Okay, now it's very unusual for me to use colloquialisms like that, because normally in a diplomatic context, I try to avoid using colloquialisms because they don't always translate very well. I see so many American speakers get up in front of a foreign audience and start throwing out all kinds of American colloquialisms, and I'm knowing that it's going right over the head of the audience, and the interpreters are back there rolling their eyes. But in this case, I use this. And we had a good meeting, but afterwards, my American interpreter is one of the top State Department interpreters. She was the interpreter for Riza Gorbachev during the Gorbachev visit. And she was born to a Russian immigrant family in San Francisco, grew up bilingual, was fantastic. She did something that almost no other interpreter could do, and that is in her translation of remarks that she was translating, she conveyed the tone of voice inflection of the speaker. You don't see that happen very often. That's how good she was. She came up to me and she said, Dr. Kartcher, that was good and everything, but I just want you to know that an invitation to Russians to take their coats off and roll up their sleeves means you're inviting them to fight, to wrestle, to take it out in the street and settle it like real men. That's what I was... Okay, now if you're in a deterrence situation, and you're discussing nuclear weapons, and you tell your Russian colleagues, let's take this out and fight it out, what's going to happen? They're going to call Moscow and say, raise the alert level, something like that. In this case, the Russians figured out by my body motion in the context of that this wasn't an invitation for a rumble. I don't use that colloquialism anymore. You may have noticed as well, but over the last couple of years, there have been multiple calls for Americans and policymakers to better understand the cultural context of our foreign policy. We'll do things that don't come across to our foreign counterparts in the way that we intended them to. The 2004 Defense Science Board study on strategic communications attributed a great deal of the hostility to U.S. national security policy and goals to this lack of cultural understanding. And so this is one of the reasons why we've undertaken this project to revive this subfield of strategic cultures which flourished in the early 80s and late 70s to address these kinds of problems, this call for better understanding foreign cultures and what's going on. The first problem is defining what we mean by culture. And we held an entire workshop in Monterey, California last fall to wrestle with this problem. And then I later found the best definition of it in Professor Hudson's introduction to her book on culture and foreign policy. And I wish I had known this. These are the three ways that culture is used, that term, and that's the way it's defined as shared meaning and identity, value preferences, and as a template for human strategy and action. And when we mean culture, we're talking about strategic culture, and I'll define strategic later, but this is also from Professor Hudson's introduction to that book, Culture and Foreign Policy. These are examples of how cultures affect foreign policy behaviors. Now, what's interesting here, check this out. Certain cultures may predispose one to abstractive versus associative reasoning and to universalistic versus case particularistic reasoning. Now, that means that has important implications for deterrence. Because if you issue threats to this kind of a culture, they may interpret them completely different. That's the problem that we're trying to address. These are some examples of that. Some cultures where they don't trust leaders of other countries. I'll give some examples from Iran here in a moment. This is how we've defined strategic culture. Is this that I can use? Thank you. And you'll see we've drawn inadvertently on Professor Hudson's kind of description of culture, but here's where we add strategic. That very last comma, everything after that is the strategic part of this. Before that, it's the regular. Oh, yeah. Oh, right there, yeah, exactly. Thank you. It took us about an hour to hammer out this definition. We're calling this, by the way, a provisional definition, because I have instructed all the case study authors working on this project to use this as a definition, but in the course of their case studies to tell me whether they had had problems with this definition and propose revisions to it. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about how we've structured this study. This is a 2-year study, and we're partway through the second year. The first year, last year, was just designed as what we call a scoping effort to look at the field, to look at what is out there, and to determine whether there was something there sufficiently useful that it warranted going on and doing a second year. So we spent about $200,000 doing this study. The first year, we're spending about $300,000 on the second year to do that. We pay consultants, we pay travel, we pay for conferences and stuff. That's how we use those kind of funds to do a study in the Defense Department. So the culmination of this first phase was a conference in Monterey, California last September. Professor Hudson has copies of the results of that. Can I just show a whole bunch of, we hired a lot of the key people in the field of strategic culture to come in and talk to us. They wrote papers for us. They were published in this book. Professor Hudson has copies for loan to people that want to look at this a little more closely. And we had this 3-day workshop. We had some case studies come in, China, Pakistan, and India. We had a couple of speakers on each of those. And the question was, is strategic culture as a methodology, as an analytical framework, is there something there that would be useful to us in terms of understanding deterrence and other issues related to weapons of mass destruction. We concluded that there was. So the second phase that we're in now is designed to develop a framework, a common framework for comparing different strategic cultures, because that's one of the problems we found, was that there were lots of writings about strategic culture, but none of them had to use the same framework, and so they weren't very comparative. We've selected specific case studies. We're looking at how they relate to policy issues. And then, as a deliverable, the contractor doing this study is obligated to provide to me a curriculum for teaching a class on this subject. And we have several military institutions, U.S. government institutions, and civilian academic institutions already interested in adapting this course for teaching in their curriculums. Here's some of the methodology issues we ran into. No commonly accepted definition of strategic culture. Our solution was to come up with a provisional definition. There's disagreement on the intellectual boundaries of strategic culture, how it relates analytically to other things like realism, constructivism, strategic beliefs theory. There are debates about what is strategic culture, where does it come from, how much does it change over time, who creates the culture, who's the keeper of the culture. And then here's a problem that I found. It's very interesting. At this conference in Monterey, California, in September of last year, we had on one side of the room a whole bunch of really key, well-known cultural anthropologists and other sociology types. On the other side of the room, we had policymakers from the Department of State and the Department of Defense and so forth. And I had a hard time getting those two groups to talk to each other. Yeah, there's a cultural issue there. But there's an academic issue. The people on this side of the room, okay, you all are going to be the academics. You're going to represent the academics. You guys are going to represent the policymakers. The people on this side of the room didn't like these people on this side of the room, and because these were the warmongers, see. These guys were in it for the pure theoretical research, the expanding the horizons of the field of human knowledge and understanding, which sounds like a very noble cause, right? It is. These guys on this side of the room, they believe their cause is noble and just too, you know, peace and prosperity and democracy and McDonald's and Coke in every country. Oh, Microsoft in every country. I had a hard time getting these two groups to talk. They didn't speak the same language. They distrusted each other. The academics felt that the policymakers wanted to take their analytical frameworks and their knowledge and their theories and stuff and apply it to warmongering. Have you had any of this kind of experience, getting those two groups to talk?
During post 9/11 or post Iraq invasion, there was a lot of it.
I felt like getting up and giving the "Can we all get along" speech, you know. But I'll tell you what, the academics, there's one question that they hate when this question is posed, and they hate to answer this question. And let me see, I think I have it. It's the question, so what?
How do you apply this to this particular case?
That's a variant of the so what question. See, they don't want to have to be constrained by the applications of the... Anyways, this conference gave us an opportunity to talk, and the policymakers said what they wanted from the academics, and the academics said, you can't do that. I think that's a pretty accurate summary of the whole conference. So.
I'm glad I missed it.
Here's criticisms of cultural analysis. I'm sure Professor Hudson is familiar with all of these. is it really possible to link culture to specific behaviors? How do you measure culture? What happens if culture changes frequently? What's the real underlying culture? And is globalization evening out culture so that it's beginning to reduce distinctive individual cultures? By the way, a related domestic one has television. The theory was that television was going to eliminate or reduce dialects in American English. And I just read a study recently that said that hasn't happened. If you live where I do in Virginia, you get exposed to dialects. So here's what we're doing. We're going to, we finished the phase 1 scoping effort. We've confronted the methodology issue, crafting a framework. I'm going to talk about selecting case studies next and what we're doing with that. Here's what we're asking the case study authors to look at. How does a given strategic culture, what does it say about conflict and human nature? What does it say about enemies? Who's the enemy? What's the adversary? And what does the given culture say about the utility of violence or laws of war? For each case study, the authors will identify the sources of strategic culture, who is the keepers of strategic culture, national identity, adversary assessments, and I've asked them to look at views regarding weapons of mass destruction. We selected 9 case studies from a pool of about 20 countries and other things that we looked at. And we used these criteria in choosing the cases. Were they relevant to weapons of mass destruction? Was there enough material out there to do research? In some cases, we felt a case study was important because it created a baseline. In this case, the United States case study, we wanted to be a baseline. Will it contribute to curriculum development? That is, will it provide a balanced view of the whole field of strategic culture? And is the particular case study useful for addressing some of these methodology issues? Here's the case studies we've chosen and who we have selected to write the case studies. Tom Mankin is doing the United States. He just completed a book on the role of technology in the U.S. way of war. Greg Giles is doing Israel. Willis Stanley is doing Iran. By the way, both Greg Giles and Willis Stanley have both done some really important recent work on Iran's strategic culture. In fact, Greg Giles has presented his work on Iran to Congress. Joe Bermudez is doing North Korea. Somebody named Murhaf Joajadi is doing Syria. I haven't met those two gentlemen yet. But the big conference on the second phase of this is going to be held tomorrow and Friday in Park City, Utah. So nearly all of these folks, plus a bunch of others involved in this project, are gathering in Park City, Utah. In fact, tonight will be the reception that kicks off this. And they are going to present, these guys are going to present their initial case studies in these strategic cultures. And it's really, that's going to be putting some content into this effort then, is looking at these case studies.
Kerry?
Yeah.
I thought you said there were 20 countries.
We had a pool of 20 countries.
Oh.
We couldn't do all 20 countries. $300,000 only goes so far in a study like this. You'd be surprised how little that gets you. So we narrowed that 20 down to 9. Was there another question? Yes, sir.
I noticed they're almost all Asian countries. Is there a reason that, say, South America or other countries, Middle East?
Yes, there is. Yeah. Let me go back to. remember the criteria we used in choosing these. That is, they had to have some significant relationship to weapons of mass destruction. So there were some very interesting case study proposals related to South America and so forth. But we wanted to focus on those countries that had weapons of mass destruction, ambitions, or some relevance to that. These are going to be really key ones, I think. Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Well, all of these, I think, are going to have very key implications for U.S. policy. In addition to those case studies, we're having 3 people do essays on this, which will take the case studies and then say, what do they mean for policy and stuff. Professor James Smith of the Air Force Academy has been doing work over the last few years on non-state actors. So here's an interesting question. Is there a strategic culture among non-state actors? That's what he's going to look at. The answer is that within some non-state actors, yes, there is a culture. Al-Qaeda has a culture that predisposes them to act in certain ways. I will be doing an essay on strategic cultures and weapons of mass destruction, and I'm going to give you a preview of that. And Daryl Howlett, who has been an important scholar in the field of strategic cultures for the last few years, is going to do an essay on the future of strategic culture. Does culture matter? I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. These are our 4 national security goals: assure, dissuade, deter, and defeat. Assure allies and friends that we are committed to their security. Dissuade states and non-state actors from proliferation. Deter states and actors from employing weapons of mass destruction, and then defeat those states who cannot be deterred from using it. And our premise is that an understanding culture is necessary to do each one of those things. So we keep coming back to this question, though, and that is, when does strategic culture matter? And here's Michael Desch's answer from an essay he did. It's in that publication for our first phase of the project. Cultural variables may explain the lag between structural change and alterations in state behavior, may account for why some states behave irrationally and don't adapt to constraints of the international system. And in structurally indeterminate situations, domestic variables such as culture may have more independent impact. Now, here's the problem that I have with this. At some point, I'm going to have to go into the Office of the Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation and tell Mr. Assistant Secretary why he should care about strategic culture in his policy making. And if I go in and I say, Mr. Assistant Secretary or Mr. Undersecretary, strategic culture is important, sir, because it may explain the lag between structural change and alterations in state behavior. What is he going to do? What if I go in and say, Mr. Undersecretary, in structurally indeterminate situations, domestic variables may have a more independent impact. What is he going to do? Now, all the guys on this side of the room understand exactly what that means, because each of those terms has a very specific analytical and theoretical annotation. But what is the Assistant Secretary of State going to say? In this case, his name is Steve Rodemaker. He's a very fine man. He's a lawyer by training. He's worked on Capitol Hill. He has no background whatsoever in the theory of international relations or foreign policy analysis. I have to translate this academic speak into policy speak. So here's how I would translate each one of those phrases. States don't always respond immediately to changes in the structure of, and I may have to explain what structure of international relations. Okay, I'll say balance of power, Mr. Secretary. Yeah, okay, I get that. And when he reads this and he goes, huh, what the heck? What are you talking about? I'll just say, look, some states have modes of behavior that resist outside influences. And he'll go, oh, I get that. It's not speaking down to them, it's just translating it into words that mean something to them. Okay, I had a hard time with the structurally indeterminate situations. But here's my translation. It means circumstances are in flux. Is that a good translation? Does somebody else have a better suggestion for how to translate structurally indeterminate situations? So when does strategic culture matter? We came up with these 6 hypotheses about the circumstances under which strategic culture would be important. We're going to test those in these case studies. Here's the policy implications that I've asked the authors to help me understand. Does strategic culture determine situations under which a state will acquire weapons of mass destruction? Does it shape their, for example, Israel. The story about how Israel made the decision to develop a nuclear weapons capability is very interesting, and details about it are just now beginning to come out. But it appears that there was a very strong strategic culture aspect to that. Does strategic culture influence decisions to use weapons of mass destruction? Now, we don't have a lot of cases to look at in terms of when weapons of mass destruction were used, but we do have some chem and bio weapon uses that we could look at. Does strategic culture promote tendencies to proliferate weapons of mass destruction? Does culture affect how a nation views adherence to its international regimes, international treaties and agreements? By the way, these are all question marks now, and through the course of the rest of the study, we're going to answer these questions. Let me just talk a little bit about this last one, adherence to international norms, because 2 weeks ago in Washington, I attended a very interesting seminar in which 3 speakers came in and talked about Iranian negotiating behavior. And all 3 of them were people who had had a great deal of experience in Tehran negotiating with the Russians or with the Iranians. One of them was a British diplomat, and the other one was a U.S. diplomat, and one was a U.S. academic. But it was interesting that all 3 said the same thing. Iranians cannot be relied upon to honor commitments and promises even after they've been made. All 3 of the speakers said that same thing. Now, why is that? Well, they gave some reasons for why that is. First of all, it's important to understand that we in the West are infidels. What does that mean? You need to know how these cultures view us as Americans. And to a lot of cultures in the Islamic world, we are infidels. And that word has very specific, very deep, very rich, very historical meaning. In fact, it has emotional connotations as well. What does it mean? Can somebody suggest? Okay, that's one of its connotations. But what's the definition of infidel?
People who do not accept the Quran.
That's getting a lot closer, yes.
Not part of our culture.
That's part of it. Professor Knudsen.
Root Latin word is the same as faith. So not of the faith.
That's right. Unbelieving, not of the faith, does not accept Muhammad as the prophet, does not accept Allah as the one and true God. Okay, now, you are infidels. What does that mean in terms of say I'm an Iranian, I'm Shiite, and I believe in Allah and the one true prophet and so forth. I don't have to have the same kind of legal obligation towards you as infidels that I have towards other believers, because you are lesser importance.
We may be killed without compunction.
There are some elements of Islam that believe that. I would not use that to characterize all of Islam, but there are some elements. But what it turns out that there is a tradition of perspectives on international law within Islam, and a friend of mine brought my attention to a book on this subject, Islamic Views of the Law of Nations. And it was published in the 1960s, and I found it on eBay and bought a copy, which amazes me that you can get a book from the 1960s, like this. Actually, I didn't find it on eBay. I found it on alibris.com, one of my favorite websites. It's a used book search site. And it turns out that there is a long-standing tradition within the Islamic world where you are not committed to honor agreements with non-Islamic cultures because they are of lesser importance. Part of it is because those infidels can't be trusted. So why should you honor agreements with unbelievers who are unclean and untrustworthy to begin with? So adherence to international regimes has very important implications for resolving the current Iranian crisis. What happens if the United Nations signs an agreement with Iran and resolves everything? If these guys are right about Iranian strategic culture, we will not be able to count on Iran adhering to that agreement unless there's some other compelling thing backing it up. See? Okay. Now, here is an example of a strategic culture, and I want you to think about these implications. What if the views within a given strategic culture said that using nuclear weapons could be justified by the culture's shared narrative, especially against other cultures? What if that culture assumed that a wider... Now, when I get through these, I want you to tell me which culture you think this is describing. What if this culture assumed that a wider conflict with other civilizations was inevitable? By the way, we as Mormons, do we think there's a grand conflict that's inevitable at the end of... Well, we actually don't use the word inevitable because we believe that there could be a whole-scale conversion that heads it off. But what are the chances of that? Pretty minimal. Okay. Assumed a wider conflict was inevitable. And furthermore, what if some in that culture believed that not only was it inevitable, but it should be encouraged, it should be brought on? Because that culture would emerge from that conflict better off. What if that culture's leaders did not have a very sound appreciation of the destructiveness of a nuclear war? What if that culture believed its principal enemy was the great Satan? What if that culture's shared narrative included a view that it was the chosen people of God, that God was on its side, that God justified its policies, that God would help it vanquish or punish its enemies? By the way, that punishment plays a very interesting role in some strategic cultures. And that God would help it prevail in any conflict with those. Now, what culture do you think I'm describing? Okay, there's one, a nomination for Al-Qaeda. Any other?
Monotheistic fundamentalists.
What, be more
Christian,
specific.
and Jewish fundamentalists.
Okay, you read the answers. He read the I'm going to come back to that. What was your nomination?
Israel.
Any United States? Okay, if you take away this great Satan, that's cheating for me to put that in there because that was a kind of a dead giveaway. But if you take that out, okay, when I presented this to the academics at the University of Chicago 2 months ago at a workshop, they all said, hey, that's the United States. And I was like, what? How could you possibly ascribe that? Anyways. Okay, Israel, Al-Qaeda, Islam. Now, sir, tell me your answer again.
The monotheistic religions that are fundamentalist.
Now,
Judaism.
what is fascinating about that answer is it's so true. There are elements of all of this in each of the three monotheistic cultures, religions actually, and I can just talk about the difference between religion and culture. In my view, religion is a subset of culture. But this could apply to any of a couple of different cultures. And that is really disturbing. That is really scary. If you get cultures that acquire a significant nuclear weapons capability and they have this kind of view, what are the chances of deterring that culture? Let me wrap this up by sharing with you a little bit about Willis Stanley's study of Iranian strategic culture. They used a very fascinating methodology to develop a profile of Iranian strategic culture. They identified relatives living in the United States of current Iranian leaders. And it turns out, I asked them how did they find them and how did they track them down. They had different ways of doing it. Not all of which they're ready to share with me, but they told me some. They were able to find a couple of hundred, 200 or 300 relatives in the United States of current Iranian leaders, not Ahmadinejad because he hadn't yet been elected president, but of the other ruler and leaders. And they went and interviewed those people. And they said, how does your uncle or your cousin who's in this position, how does he view the world? What is his motivation? And they were able to do kind of interviews by proxy with these relatives. And they were able to, from those interviews, compile a strategic profile of Iranian leaders. And it's very interesting because the bottom line was they cannot be deterred. So what does that mean? What does that mean for us? It could mean the revival of one of Utah Valley's great early industries, bomb shelter building. Utah Valley here was the global headquarters of bomb shelter construction back in the 60s and 70s. And 80s. I wasn't going to go that far, but they cannot be deterred. What is that? What are the implications of that?
I have a question. Is there anything in the threat to the country itself that is a classical deterrence? Does that have any effect?
Not according to this analysis. Okay, we wondered, would a threat to their personal survival be a deterrent? No, because they are the chosen people of God. It is their responsibility to make sure that the kingdom of God survives. Does any of this start sounding familiar to our own concept? So that becomes a problem. Now, my answer to that is that we can't necessarily assume that they cannot be deterred, but we should pursue diplomacy because that could mitigate some of the consequences of a conflict if it came to that. But it also means that we should pursue certain damage limitation strategies. And it should mean that we should be prepared, if necessary, to defend ourselves. But the main point for what I've presented here is we need to understand that culture so that we can communicate with them, so that we understand what our role is and how they view us. So I'm hoping that our study of strategic culture helps provide insights into those kind of policy issues. And one of the reasons it was important for me to present this to you is because I view this community here, especially Brigham Young University, but the broader community here in Utah, as the home of a great deal of cultural understanding by virtue of a lot of the returned missionaries and our intercultural experiences, our openness to other cultures. There's a great deal of expertise here that I want to tap into, which is one of the reasons why I instructed my contractor team to work with the University of Utah in hosting this conference that will be held tomorrow and Friday on this project, and to draw from the broader Utah University academic environment. Comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Did you consider including Saudi Arabia in your list?
Yes, we did. We had a lot of discussion about whether to include Saudi Arabia.
Did you include it because it doesn't have wetlands?
No, we decided to use, we wanted an example of a Sunni culture, and we wanted an example of a Shia culture. And it could be argued that Saudi Arabia is neither, but we chose some other examples of those instead. Yes, sir, in the back.
The example you gave was Iran. How would China fit into this model since they really don't have a religious culture? And where are they on the thread analysis?
They actually do have a religious culture, depending on how you define religion. It turns out that there are two views of China's strategic culture. There's a view of China's strategic culture that interprets it in light of Confucian philosophy. And it says that culture is determined or shaped a lot by Confucian ideals of moral superiority and righteousness and so forth. One of the best examples of that interpretation of Chinese strategic culture is in Professor Hudson's book on culture and foreign policy. What was the name of that author? Rosita Delius. She's an Australian professor, right? There is, however, another interpretation of Chinese culture which says that over the last 20 years, a more modern, offensive culture has arisen that I don't know how I would define it, but maybe it's more realpolitik kind of. It's what?
It's the legalist tradition, Chinese philosophy,
But it's based on a much more offensive interpretation of engaging your enemies and a strategy. And I am still assessing the validity of those two schools of thought. I see the value in both of those, but I haven't decided which one is more ascendant right now. That's one of the issues we need to address. Let me go here, and then I'll come back over here. Yes, sir. Yeah, do you know any leaders like that? I don't know any. I do know some that are aware and sensitive to the economic forces of globalization and are making efforts to adapt to that. But the leaders that I'm familiar with all have very strong nationalistic bases. And they know that their legitimacy as leaders derives from a nationalism, but not globalization as a fundamental basis of their leadership philosophy. So there is an impact of globalization, but maybe not at that level. Yes, sir?
How does the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere fit into that framework?
That was a Japanese
Yeah, I think some of
con.
it, you have some of it that they didn't quite have the religious underpinnings. It was more the tribal exceptionalism. We're the superior tribe in this neighborhood, and therefore we have a right to leadership. And so the idea that religion is a subset of culture, you took some of up there before, some of the sort of contemporary code words out of there. They're like nuclear, the propensity to use nuclear. You could argue that there is a general inability to appreciate the devastation of warfare until after the fact. And it isn't just nuclear, it's all kinds of warfare. That these kinds of tribal issues arise, and religion becomes a part of those. But I think we're really talking about is a broader kind of group relationship.
We had a lot of discussions among our group about Japan as a case study. And Japan has a dominant strategic culture in the post-World War II era that's very self-defense oriented, very anti-military. But there's a lot of evidence that that is changing now.
Or returning.
No, changing. I'm not convinced it's returning yet. It may emerge that way. So I recognize that as a possible direction, but I'm not convinced that's the direction that's going in now, but it could turn out that way. Professor Hudson, I think we've used up our time. Anyways, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I look forward to interacting with you more in the future on these projects.